In this episode, we will talk about a term I coined called collective co-regulation. It's a unique way that Filipinos in the islands, especially, use to express and seek affection. It's also crucial to understand it because it gives breath to the reason why we are speaking a foreign love language in our Filipinx homes. Are Filipinos truly bilingual? We use the same language at home but speak in love languages foreign to each other, together but separated. Kamusta? I'm Rowan, licensed psychotherapist mom, immigrant twice, first generation Pinoy raising my mixed Filipino-American children in America. I found that after visiting 500 Filipino homes, I continue to be a student of the culture. In this podcast, we would be seatmates in this beautiful cultural classroom. And by the way, did I tell you I need my kaping barako straight from Batangas before each class? If you're interested in learning the deep intricacies of the Filipino culture, especially as it merged with American culture, talks about trauma-informed care and deepening your Filipino relationships across generations, which includes my fave topic, Pinoy love languages, you're in the right place. If you haven't yet, please leave a stellar review for this podcast if you're enjoying its content. I'll be so stoked and I really appreciate it. But most of all, it allows us to be discovered by other Filipinx all over the world. Maraming salamat in advance. Kamusta everyone? It's Rowan and thank you for hanging out with me today. Before we begin, I want to do a quick shout out to my hubby who is the podcast editor for all of my episodes. So the content is from me and he brings them to your ears. So maraming salamat. And please don't edit out this part. Now, to make sense of this episode, it would be really helpful and I highly recommend that you go back to the two previous episodes. One is on self-regulation and then the other one is on co-regulation. This episode that you've reached right now is the collective co-regulation. But in a nutshell, let me just give you a quick rundown. Now, self-regulation is your ability to self-soothe, to find a way if you're frustrated, anxious, that you find a balance, you find a way to center yourself, self-regulation. Co-regulation is when you are seeking proximity, as we often do, like children do that all the time with their parents, but also couples would do that with one another. You're co-regulating. Maybe you had a terrible day and you've done the best that you could. You probably journal, you took a walk, but it's not enough. And so you co-regulate. You bathe in someone's warmth, if you will, helping you soothe yourself. So that's self-regulation versus co-regulation. Now, both are essential skills to master. The hope is that as we learn how to self regulate, we also know when to reach out for others because we are social beings anyway. And more than we want to believe it or not, our feelings towards ourselves, our decision making process are shaped by the groups we belong to. Now, when we're talking about collective co-regulation, it's very unique, but I'm also sure that in some other collectivistic culture that they may share facets of it, but it may also be unique in their cultural format. When you think about the Philippines, we have a very complex social political history. Geographically, we are one of the most typhoon visited countries in the whole world, and many other variables that makes the Philippines unique. Now, in the last two episodes, I talked about a case example of Junjun, a kid who was 3 years old and he was upset, mom is leaving, and how we pacify Junjun based on two different cultures. One in America, how Junjun is pacified in America, and how Junjun is pacified in the Philippines, in the islands. And you can go back to the specific episodes to take a listen. But what I want you to have a takeaway is that the honing of self regulation skills and co regulation skills differ in a cultural context. So, in the context of being in America, Junjun would have to really learn how to self regulate. We emphasize being independent, to have the right for self determination. I mean, as early as when a child learns to speak, we ask the child, would you like a hamburger or chicken nuggets? Would you like to wear this red dress or this pink dress? In the Philippines, there's more honing of that co regulation skills. Now, I also talked about in the last episode the difference between co regulation and codependency. So, we're not talking about codependency in this episode. We're just talking about the natural need of a person to need someone else. There was a study in London, and I mentioned this in my free webinar called Pinoy Love Language. And if you haven't downloaded that webinar, you get just free access whenever you want to. Everything is in the show notes, but I shared there the study where even our brains, the I think it's the hypothalamus that was different between the bus driver in London versus the taxi driver. And the reason for that is the taxi driver had more practice, therefore, more skill of going to like the small roads and changing roads or just to get to the destination of his passenger. As to the bus driver is simply following a route, a same path day in and day out. And it even show how in their brain scan it looks different. Not that one is better than the other, not that Filipino culture is better than the American culture. Certainly, we can learn from both cultures. The point is, we hone certain skills based on the practice we're given. And so, even that, as we talk about the brain, the neuroplasticity of our brain, there's more practice. So the Filipino brain, as far as like being the immigrant, like born and raised in the Philippines, they have more practice as far as like co-regulating. Now, as you listen to this, of course, if I give you an example, you might say, yeah, that's true, but I know someone who's not like that. And the response would be, of course, because it's really impossible to give a scenario that fits each and every person. So when we're talking about these expressions, they're a collective expression. They're more the pattern in the culture. Now, the role of the parents, usually it's the mom, the father, is to keep the child safe, to keep the child alive, to nurture the child. Now, the juxtaposition for this is that for a mother to calm down her own baby, she needs some type of self regulation skill. If she's anxious, as we say, anxious mother, anxious child, she would have a hard time calming down her child. And so it begins in your own space. If a child only learns how to co-regulate and they have not beefed up their skill on self-regulation skill. Now, in a collective co-regulation society, as I've coined that term, because I was trying to find a way to explain this nuance. Now, a parent can have so many other people around her, reliable and consistent other caregivers, assumed by the child to have a similar role as the parent, but less in hierarchy because that's the parent and that's the lola and that's another tita and that's a neighbor. But it allows the child to feel a sense of safety, even though perhaps the mother is not able to fully give that. Now, I am not saying or even alluding that Filipino mothers are not able to do that. As we know, if you are one, have been parented by one, Filipino mothers are very passionate about their mothering, and sometimes they could be so loving. And for other people, they might say that I have a very toxic, if you will, relationship with my own mother. Nevertheless, this extreme labeling of mothers is a manifestation of how we may take this role so seriously, and yet we might not have the capacity and the agency to be able to nurture our children in a certain way, as we might not have had that same experience from our own set of parents. But before I go on, I'll talk about the umbrella so that I could explain collective co-regulation a little bit more. There is a corresponding blog post. If you like to read, there's a collective co-regulation blog post, and I will link that in the show notes. But let's take a break, and I'll be right back. Diyan ka lang. This episode is brought to you by Story Therapy. This is therapy and coaching blended together that hugs neuroscience, creativity, and honoring the wisdom of your body to heal. It's a 3-month framework that includes 10 one-on-one sessions with me. To check out if we're a good fit, see the link in the show notes for a complimentary consult. So going back, I mentioned there are other caregivers. Now, because the umbrella, a solo umbrella, that's self-regulation, right? Co-regulation, as I mentioned, is sharing an umbrella, going under somebody's umbrella. But let's say that the honed skill in the Filipino culture, society is seeking physical proximity so that you feel regulated. Welcome back, and thanks for sticking around. Let's talk about collective co regulation using the umbrella metaphor. So, I talked about if you are honing your skill for self regulation, just imagine that your umbrella, as you were a kid, the role of the parent is to make sure your own umbrella is sturdy so that when it rains, you're not going to get wet. Now, in a community and a society where we co-regulate, the honing is that you go under somebody's umbrella, even though it doesn't mean that you never hone your own umbrella, but that you can seek somebody's umbrella if need be. So that's something that's acceptable, and it's okay to be interdependent, not codependent. I think that we do get that confused very much in the American society of needing others. But of course, if you are confused, I did the kilikili metaphor in the previous episode. So go ahead and check that out. As I was saying, the mother need not be perfect, right? She might have an umbrella. Now, the mother might not be the perfect parent, and she was her skill was honed in seeking also others for help. So the mother basically, or whoever's the caregiver, need not be perfect because there are other in community as far as caregiving. Now, there is a variation which I would not expound on in this episode. There is a variation when it comes to socioeconomic status. Now, if you're middle class in the Philippines upwards, you might have people in the home helping you, but nevertheless, they are still hands when it comes to helping with the caregiving practice in the household. So if the mother is busy or she's not able to self regulate, and if a child is crying, if you just imagine there are other lots of people there that would help her pacify the child, just like the example that I gave with Junjun. When he was crying in the Philippine cultural context, the brothers were passing him on, and then another brother, and then it was the father eventually until he stopped crying. And when Junjun was in America, of course, the adults tried their best, but he'll have to learn because mother had to work to self regulate. And when he did, he was given a reinforcement by the teacher's reward, good job, okay, are you ready to join your classmates now? In When you imagine in the Philippines or in a mall, if you've seen this umbrella and they use it as the ceiling, like a decker, that's collective co regulation. That's when you have a ceiling of umbrella and the umbrella may have a little hole here. Maybe one umbrella is a little flimsy. Maybe one umbrella is old, not as sturdy. You might have those types of umbrella on the ceiling. And when it rains, you might get rained on. But for the most part, because there's like one umbrella, two umbrellas, so many umbrellas, it's almost really on top of you, your ceiling, it keeps you protected and safe for the most part. That's collective co-regulation. And what happens in immigration, and let's just say it's the mother, it's just an easier example. When the mother leaves and the skill that's not always honed, because it might not be needed to be honed in the way that we do in a very individualistic culture. She leaves those umbrellas. She doesn't have those umbrella ceiling. She goes in the plane with her own umbrella. And when she gets to America, she notices that her own umbrella is pretty flimsy, right? She's learning this whole culture about self care, do this for yourself, when she's kind of used to co regulating. Basically, that self care can also be other scarer, hanging out with other people. Growing up, I noticed that even my mom, for instance, if she's doing self care, she might go to, we call it a parlor, but like you might go get pedicure, get your hair cut, but she's constantly still with other women chit chatting, and that's kind of like the self care. Now, it doesn't mean that all women are the same, but it's possible that women who are in a more collective culture may not need as much space than women in individualistic culture. I have mentioned maybe a couple of times in other episodes that even in research of cultural psychologists, that the bubble that exists, that bubble, that spacing between one person to the other, is the gap is much wider in American culture compared to other cultures. Hispanic culture much closer, and definitely even closer for Filipinos. I mean, you could just see that when we ride our jeepneys, we're like sardines. In MRTs, which is like our BART transportation system in the Philippines, a Filipino is quite comfortable being squeezed, except if someone's mabaho. That's what they say. I was just reading a scholar's notebook, one of the scholars in the Philippines, and mentioning that the Filipino sense of smell is quite sensitive. So going back, when the mother immigrates, she noticed, oh my goodness, my umbrella is flimsy. Now she would have to catch up, learning to strengthen her umbrella. And now she's immigrating, and of course, she has to find a job. Now she's purchased a home. Now she has three kids. And that skill, that part of self regulation has not been honed as much, because not that she's less of a woman, because in a cultural sense, she might not need all that. When she begins parenting, that's when the foreign love language occurs. And we'll talk more about specific Pinoy love languages, and there's a couple in our past episodes. But that's when I noticed that the immigrant parent may be seeking to co regulate, but the child is not able to read her cues. And she tries. And I have mentioned before that, especially for a young child, it's really not the responsibility of the child to figure out the parent. Nevertheless, the mother might be seeking affection. And she's tired, she's been working two jobs, and she actually seeking affection in a certain way. And when her longing is not met, it becomes almost a resentment, and she may start to spit out words like, I can't believe, I'm working two jobs. Or she starts to lament, and the child is bewildered by her deep anguish, her lamentation can be so confusing. But the co regulation strategy is one that we must learn to midway interpret, but also the immigrant would have to learn to show herself or himself a little bit more directly, so the child would be able to decode her longing. That's one of the reasons why the foreign language we speak in our homes, as far as our love languages, is hard to decipher, because we don't talk about this very unique way that we co-regulate, we seek love. There is a longing. The parent is hoping the child would read, or just has a expectation is unknown. There's a longing from the parent that a child is unable to read, or even conscious that there is such a longing. And the child may feel that I'm just not enough to feel. Does my mother love me? And then it becomes a cycle of the mother feeling not good enough as far as her mothering, and that exudes in the way she mothers and her lamentation. And the child feels that resentment, because nevertheless I am just a child trying to figure out the adults in my life, and it's such a responsibility for a child. But nevertheless, there is both a longing for the mother. Just in this example, I'm just going to use the mother and the child. Now, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to invite you to read the blog. There's more information therein. Also, if you haven't yet, just download the free webinar. It's super good information. It's really delivered so that we would have a more common love language in our Filipinx homes. I thank you for being here. Maraming pong salamat. Again, I'm signing off. This is Rowan. Ingat!